program is provided without charge by Reformed Theological Seminary, which reserves all rights. To learn how you can support RTS, please visit give.rts.edu.
Okay, let's move on to the next section, which is the early Christian use of the Codex. And I want to talk a little bit about the codices. Every manuscript you've seen so far, and this is true in early Christianity, I've kind of alluded to this before, is not on a scroll, okay? In the ancient world, there were two kinds of book formats. One is the scroll, and then one is the, codex, okay, where there's writings in a standard book format with a binding in the middle. Let's talk about each format for a moment. First, the scroll is a well-established book format because we know about it from other manuscript discoveries, like the Dead Sea Scrolls. We know that in the first century in Judaism, this was the preferred format of choice. Scripture would be written on scrolls. Scrolls were a pretty useful way to do books because one of the things that made scrolls is the fact that writing was only done on one side of the page. Okay, you would put writing on one side of the page, and then you would roll it up on each end, and it was a long stretch. So you would find your part by rolling up one side and unrolling the other side, and you do it together with your hands. And now, for you and I, we would look like we were fumbling around if we tried to do it. But if you were used to reading, you could move pretty fast through a scroll if you knew how to operate it. And you just kind of go through it, find your part, and read it, and so on. So the writing's only on one side of the page. You can see why they did that. Protect the writing. When you roll it up, the outside does not have text on it. So the writing is protected and guarded, and this was the standard book format. As we've already observed, Christians did not use this book format most of the time. In fact, Christians, as I've already indicated, used a standard leaf book with writing on both sides of the page that you would turn bound at the spine. This, of course, is called a codex. And I mentioned in my article that you're going to read on early Christian book production all the little ins and outs of how codices were made. There's different kinds of codices. A very rudimentary codice, you just get a stack of paper and you fold it and kind of crease it at the spine and stitch it, and you got a codex, okay? But as you know, you can only do that with so much paper before it just doesn't work. I mean, if you wanted to write a really thick codex and you just take a huge stack of paper and fold it, what's going to happen? Try to fold 40 sheets of paper and make a book out of it. Is that going to work?
You're not going to be able to crease them.
Yeah, not going to be able to crease them. What's going to happen to those middle pages? They're going to stick out and bulge. It's not going to be spaced right. So what ends up happening is they end up coming up with a different way to do codices, which is what's called a multi-quire codex. Multi-quire codex, if you look at it on the side, are basically sets of sheets. So it'd be like a set of like 4 sheets, and then another set of 4 sheets, then another set of 4 sheets, another set of 4 sheets. So there'd be multiple folds all the way through, bound at the spine if you're looking at it from the side. It's actually pretty sophisticated book technology. You may not realize now that the books you read are multi-quire codices. Like if you probably never even looked at this, but if you were to look carefully at the binding of even your Bibles, they do it this way. They put in 4 or 5 pages at a time in a set and bind it, and then another 5 pages in a set and bind it. And this is how they do it even today. So this is a pretty remarkable book technology that hasn't actually gone away for all these years. What made the Codex interesting for early Christians, as I've already indicated, is the uniformity of usage for it. When you find New Testament manuscripts, you can't hardly even find a single one not on a codex. Now, this is stunning. Why? Because their heritage was Judaism, where everybody used scrolls. And they lived in a Greco-Roman world, where everybody used scrolls. And yet Christians suddenly use the codex. And we're talking everywhere. You can't hardly find a text without it as far back as you can go. So it was uniform, it was early, widespread use of the codex. Now, these are the kinds of conundrums that historians find fascinating because it raises all kinds of suggestions about why Christians preferred the codex and what would have led to such a thing. I mentioned in my article a few things which we'll get to in just a second, but this is one of those sort of CSI kind of deals where you got to go in and just look at all the evidence and figure out what would have led Christians to do this. And there's been all kinds of suggestions. Some have said, well, maybe Christians used the codex because it was a lot more easy to use than a scroll. You could just flip through the pages. Okay, maybe that's true. But then why weren't everybody else using it then? See, the problem is you've got to come up with a reason that Christians would have wanted to use it, but not everybody else. Like, if it was that much better of a book format, then why didn't everybody else use it? It was just more convenient. Some have suggested it was cheaper, monetary, right? And therefore, you saved money. There's no evidence really that you save much money using a codices. And so you could go on and on with different solutions, and people have come up with all kinds of ideas, but you need something that can explain an early exclusive preference for the Codex by Christians that really can't be explained by anything else. And this is where there's been basically two competing theories I find persuasive for what Christians would have wanted to do that they couldn't do with the scroll, that they could only do with the Codex, okay? And the first of those is simply this. One thesis is that Christians adopted the Codex because it could do something no other book format could do, and that is hold all four Gospels in one volume. Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. If you do the math on Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John and try to figure out how long of a scroll it would take to hold all four Gospels, you'd have a scroll 80 feet long. It'd be like, imagine taking that around with you on a trip. Here's my four Gospel scroll, right, over your shoulder. It'd be huge. It'd be completely unwieldy. No, there's no scroll that could possibly function like that. Christians, though, who wanted to bind the Codex or bind four Gospels into a single Codex, found the Codex could hold it. And no other book format they were aware of, at least at this time, could do it. And so it allowed them to do something they would want to do, but that no one else or no other book format would have allowed them to do it. That is a suggestion that's been made, I think is very compelling and certainly possible. If that's right, here's what's interesting about it. Christians adopted the Codex certainly by the end of the first century. By the beginning of the second century, it's all codices. So certainly at the end of the first century, Christians made this transition. If they made it because they wanted to hold all four Gospels in one volume, then that means they were thinking about doing that at the end of the first century. That means there was a concept of a fourfold Gospel at the end of the first century. You realize how early that is? It's incredibly early. John wrote probably around 90 A.D. That means somewhere right around the time John wrote, they were already thinking about linking these four together in a way that they needed a book format that could do it. See, the thing that's interesting about a codex is that it's a way of signifying your canon because it has boundaries to it. Some things are in, some things are out. So you can see why it would have functioned this way. Another suggestion out there, similar, is that it wasn't the four Gospels that Christians were trying to put in one volume, but Paul's letters trying to put in one volume. And that again, a scroll couldn't have done all 13 of Paul's letters, so they needed a codex that could do it. And this would have been something that would have provided an opportunity to do that. Regardless of whether you go with the Gospels thesis or the Pauline letters thesis, here's the point I want you to see, is that it seems like the preference for the codex is a symptom of canon in early Christianity. In other words, it's a result of Christians thinking canonically. They chose the codex as a format because of discussions about which books were in and which books were out. And if that's true, then that means that canonical discussions were happening vastly early, much earlier in early Christianity than people would have ever really considered possible. And that, I think, is a very interesting feature of early Christianity. Now, there's this discussion goes on and on. You know, one other theory out there I'll just throw out since we're on the subject is some have suggested that Christians used the codex for their Gospels first because they used to take notes about what Jesus said in early notebooks, which were in the form of codices. And since the earliest notes about the sayings of Jesus were in codices, it was natural that it would eventually be the Gospels in the same book format. That's possible. And so there's another little interesting idea of what could have led to the adoption of the Codex in early Christianity. Regardless of what theory you adapt, here's the thing that's interesting, is it shows again that Christianity was very organized and very unified around its scribal activity. I mean, who got the memo that said, okay, everybody, we need to use the Codex. You guys over in Egypt, Codex. Guys down in Syria and Palestine, Codex. You know, you guys in Gaul, Codex. Has everyone got the message? Okay, great. Go out and copy books. I mean, think about it. How did that happen? Somewhere along the lines, apparently there was a robust communication network somehow in early Christianity that everyone kind of got the message that the Codex was the thing you used for Christian books. In fact, it got so much that way that codices almost were the defining mark of a Christian book, along with the Nomina Sacra. Remember the Nomina Sacra we talked about yesterday? If you got a book, and it was in the form of a codex, and had the Nomina Sacra, it had Christian written all over it. It was the defining visual characteristics that told you a book was a Christian book. And that largely has to do with the kind of content they put in codices. Another suggestion that's out there. People said, look, the transportability of codices, these sort of hide small pocketbooks, is driven by the desire to hide material from Roman authorities. Is that possible? Yes. And so you could argue that's a distinctive concern of Christians because they're the ones being persecuted, right? So maybe that is part of the factor. A scholar by the name of J. Eldon Epp, EPP, Epp has made a lengthy argument that it's this sort of portability, convenience, travel. A lot of codices are small, and so there's a sense in which you can travel around easily with them, and therefore it's great for missionary religions. And since Christianity was a missionary religion, they loved it. Okay, maybe. I'm not sure that's quite pushing me over the edge. Here's the other thing you need, though, is that pragmatic reasons like that, a convenience and stuff like that would suggest a slow transition, where you're using the scroll and you begin to learn over time that, wow, the codex is really convenient. But that's not what we have. We have a really hard transition. And so you have to wonder what could account for that kind of monumental shift. And I don't know if portability can get you there, if that makes sense. Of course, you could have multiple factors too, right? So it doesn't have to be just one factor that explains the adoption of the codex. It could be many things happening at once that kind of pushed Christians over the edge. But whatever pushed Christians over the edge, what's interesting is it happened dramatically, and it happened quickly. And in fact, as I said before, it's so dominant among Christians that earlier scholars used to think that Christians invented the codex. Like, well, look, it's all over Christianity. Maybe Christians made it up, but it's not true now.
Thoughts on why it is unique to Christianity over Judaism, which also has similarly long volumes of text that they want to hold together?
Yeah, there's a difference, though, between wanting to hold your whole canon together, okay, and there's a lot of books in the Old Testament canon, versus wanting people to see the four Gospels as one Gospel. In other words, there's no comparable literary entity in the Old Testament like the fourfold Gospel, okay, which is why I actually think the Gospels are more likely to explain this than Paul. Because Paul is, like you said, well, if you want to collect books together with Paul, wouldn't there be other books that were like Paul's letters? Wouldn't you want to link other Old Testament books together? Wouldn't you want a volume that could hold the wisdom books or the prophets or something like this? But there's something about the fourfold gospel that I think Christians would have wanted for you to see a 4 in 1, 1 in 4 kind of unity to it. One book, four perspectives. If you go with that as a theological rationale, you can see why the Codex would have been the perfect vehicle for that. Now, of course, all this is speculation, right? No one wrote down, oh, here's why we chose the Codex. So everyone's got their theory. But it is fascinating to sort of think about how Christianity ended up here. When all's said and done, though, what you're left with is a very distinctive textual identity that Christians have. They have a distinct book format, Codex. They have a distinct form of abbreviation in the Nomina Sacra. They even have a distinct style of writing because they want to do it for public reading. Everything about the Christian literary culture is very intentional. That tells you that this is not some half-cocked, made-up, mom-and-pa operation, which I think is what we're trying to get at here when it comes to the stability of the Christian text. All right. The next heading there is the content of Christian codices. I mentioned a moment ago that the Codex had begun to mark what counted as a Christian book. And here's what's fascinating. It seems that Christians reserve the Codex mainly for their scriptural texts. This is a phenomenon that I find curious. It doesn't work both ways. Let me explain. It wasn't as if Christians wouldn't use the Codex to copy non-scriptural things, okay? They would. We have copies of the Shepherd of Hermas on a Codex, okay? So don't think that if a book appeared in the Codex, it was scriptural. That's not the point. The point, though, is if Christians wanted to designate a book as not scriptural, they would actually not use the Codex. And so we actually have books in early Christianity that are written intentionally on rolls by Christians. And given the vast preference of Christians for the Codex, anytime a Christian would sort of go retro and use a roll again, you'd step back and go, ho, what's that mean? And what's curious is that when you do see Christians using rolls or scrolls, it's almost always for non-canonical books. Do you want to know that the earliest copies of the Gospel of Thomas that we have are not on a Codex? This is interesting. The earliest copies of the Gospel of Thomas we have are on scrolls. Curious. We also have copies of other books like Shepherd of Hermas, Irenaeus' Against Heresies on scrolls. What does that tell you? That tells you that Christians generally preferred the Codex anyway, but particularly for biblical texts. And it's almost like the thing, again, that marks biblical text as unique. What I want you to see in all this, though, is just that there's a consciousness going on here in the mind of the believer, in the mind of early Christians. They're thinking canonically when you start thinking this way. What format are we going to use for that book? What format are we going to use for that book? As soon as you start asking what format we're going to use for which book, you're making distinctions amongst books. So the idea that you have an early Christianity that's not making distinctions amongst books and it's just a literary free-for-all, that doesn't fit with the evidence here. It seems that Christians are very concerned about making sure the right format goes with the right book. Now, all this sort of leads us up to a final question here on this point, and that is, do we have any evidence in the New Testament itself regarding the use of the Codex? In other words, does any writer ever mention a Codex in the writings of the New Testament? Now, of course, if you think about it, it would be really unlikely for that to happen on one level because in the early centuries of the faith, they hadn't adapted the Codex yet, okay? Since they haven't adapted the Codex yet, they're probably not going to mention it. But some of the later books, maybe in the 60s, might do it. And we do have an example. And let's look at that example in your notes here. And that is 2 Timothy 4:13. Here in 2 Timothy 4:13, probably written somewhere in the early to mid-60s, Paul is writing to Timothy, and it's the very end of his letter where he's making his final greetings and requests and so on. In fact, most of us would skip over this if we were reading it, because if we're honest, we always skip over final greetings and genealogies. Those are the two things we don't want to read. And so we would skip over this. So it's kind of a laundry list Paul's going through. So here's what he says. When you come, bring the cloak that I left with Carpus at Troas. And before that, he talks about other things. And then he says this phrase. Bring also the books, and above all, the parchments. Interesting. He tells Timothy that he wants the books and the parchments. Now, what's curious about this is he mentions two kinds of writings, books and parchments. This was ta biblia, which, needless to say, is where we get our word Bible from, right? The books. What's interesting about this word is it's not at all what we would expect. There is no Greek word for parchment. So what is going on here with Paul? He actually takes a Latin word, membrana, membrane, skin, and transliterates it into Greek. Okay, so what transliteration means is he just uses the language of Greek to make the sounds of a Latin word. This is interesting. By the way, we do this happens in other places. Sometimes people use the letters in Greek to make a sound of a Hebrew word, form of transliteration. So there's no word in Greek like that, but he's making a Hebrew sound with a Greek word. Okay. In this instance, Paul's making a Latin sound with the Greek word that means parchments. Now, when you look at that, you have to ask, what in the world does the parchments refer to? Membrana, membrane, skin, etc., is a reference to a certain kind of writing material. So what you have here, bring the skins. Now, what could Paul mean by this? Well, curiously, in other first century sources, we actually have hints at what is meant by this. I'll give you a few examples of this. We have an example from the Roman poet Martial, writing not that different from Paul's time around the 80s of the first century. He refers to a small notebook he can hold in his hand and take notes in, which in the context is clearly a codex. And what does he do? He calls it a membrana. Now, there's no doubt when you start comparing the language here that Paul is referring to by this term parchments, he's referring to a notebook, notebooks, or codices. What's he referring to with ta biblia? There's really no doubt here that this is no doubt a reference to Old Testament books. This is a bring the books. No doubt that Timothy and Paul would have traveled with Old Testament books, scrolls. He could have read them. He was educated. So Paul says, bring the books and also the codices. Now what's stunning about this is that Paul distinguishes them. In his mind, they're two different sets of books. He doesn't just say, hey, Timothy, bring all our books. No, he says, bring the ta biblia and especially the codexes. Two different sets of writings. One is clearly a reference to the Old Testament. What's the other one a reference to? Well, here's where the speculation can begin, right? The honest truth is we don't know what these codices included. Here's what we do know, is that they were usually carried around together. We do know that they were two separately identifiable textual units. And we do know that Paul really wanted to make sure Timothy brought them. Look at the language again. And above all, bring me the parchments. Most of all, bring me the codices. So let's think about this for a second. What might have been included in these codices? Of course, we don't know, but there's all kinds of options here. There's no one right answer. I have my own theory. Okay, one is he could have had a gospel. Okay, if he did have a gospel, which gospel would it likely have been based on conversations yesterday? Luke, right? Paul, 1 Timothy 5:18, remember that conversation? It seems to quote from Luke 10:7. And then Paul later says, bring me the codices. Could Paul have a copy of Luke? Well, that's very fascinating to think about. So it could be Luke. Okay, what else could it be?
Could it be his own parchments for him to write letters to churches?
So blank skins? Possibly. Although you wouldn't really necessarily carry around a group of blank parchments that would be identifiable as a book set. Like you can get that when you travel around the different places, different towns. I suppose it's possible it's just blank. It could be some other kind of Christian writing, right? TJ, do you have a theory?
One of the letters from another gospel, maybe first or second.
Okay, maybe he's got an apostolic letter from another. Maybe he's got something from Peter. Peter would have written barely by this point, so hard to know. John certainly wouldn't have written yet, so it's hard to know if he has those. So there's a couple other options on the table here. One is that Paul could have had what's called testimonia collections, right? Testimonia would have been a collection of Old Testament texts that point to Jesus as the Messiah. Okay, sort of Old Testament proof texts that show Jesus as the Messiah. We know these existed within early Christianity. Maybe Paul was carrying around these testimonia in a notebook so that when he's in the synagogues, he could debate with the Jews and sort of show all these Old Testament proof texts for Jesus. Okay, there's an option. Maybe he had early collections of Jesus sayings. It's another option. So it wasn't a gospel yet. Maybe he had sort of just a notebook filled with what Jesus had said and done. I don't know, something like that. We could speculate, but here's what I think it is. The best bet, in my opinion, for what's going on here is that these parchments are copies of Paul's own letters. Now, I know that sounds weird, but let me explain why this would be the case. In the ancient world, when you made a letter, you would often have a scribe write it for you, even if you were literate, by the way. Paul uses scribes to write his letters almost all the time. There's a few exceptions where he writes in his own hand. I'm going to come back to that in a minute. Most of the time, even a literate person like Paul would have someone else transcribe his letters for him, send them out. This is what scribes do. And when you do that, without fail in the ancient world, it was very common for a scribe to make a copy of that letter before they sent it. So if you wrote Romans, and the scribe is finished with Romans, he doesn't just send Romans. He makes a copy of Romans and then sends Romans. Okay? What's he do with the copy? Well, he keeps the copy in his own archives. Why do people do this in the ancient world? Well, lots of reasons. One is because once that letter's out the door, there's no way to get access to it again, right? Unlike our modern day. There's no way to get it back, and so you want to know what you wrote. But we also have evidence in the ancient world where, and this is from pagan writers, but we see this practice, where someone writes to someone and go, hey, the letter you sent me, I lost it. Could you send it again? And the guy writes back and goes, yeah, I'll have my scribe make another copy and send it to you. So we know they had copies of their own letters. Okay? It was very common for you to keep an archive of what you're written, and some of these archives were quite developed and sophisticated. The best analogy of this in the modern day is the way email works. I know it's strange that this would be an analogy. But what's great about email is that it makes a copy of what you wrote, right? So when you send someone a letter and it's like, it's gone out the door, right? And you think, what did I say in that letter? You can always go to your sent file, okay? You ever wrote a letter and you're like, well, how did I word that? Or what did I say? Or I forgot what I sent. And you look and you can see a copy of all your own letters that you sent out the door. It keeps an archive on your computer of this. In a similar sense, that's exactly what happened in the ancient world with scribes, is they would keep archives of their own letters. And the reasons for this were important. Why would you keep an archive of your own letter? Not only so you could resend if someone wanted, and to remind yourself of what you wrote, but here's what we know Paul did. Paul used his same letters when he wrote other ones. Okay? In other words, he drew upon his prior writings when he wrote. You ever notice how much Ephesians and Colossians look the same? People, when they see Ephesians and Colossians look the same, they conclude, that's because they're forgeries. Someone's trying to copy Paul. But Paul actually copies himself a lot. We know that he reuses his material. It's kind of like hearing the same preacher every week. If you have a church you're at every week, which I hope you are, and you hear the guy preaching every week, what happens after a while when you've been in a church a while and you have a senior pastor and he starts onto an illustration or a point? What do you say to yourself? Yeah, I've heard this before, right? Here we go again, or he's going to say this, he's going to say that. You probably do that with us as professors, no doubt. Okay, Dr. Kruger's getting ready to do his speech about the Codex or something like this, okay? You probably do that, and I get that, and here's why. When we teach, we always, to some extent, reuse material we've already put together. I mean, that's just what we do. We have a stock set of material, and we reuse it. Sometimes we reuse it in a general way, paraphrasing, but sometimes in writing, you can actually reuse it word for word. And we know that Paul would have done that, and his own letter collection would have allowed him to do that. Okay, if that's the case, then what Paul wants Timothy to bring is not only the Old Testament books, but his own books. Okay. Now, of course, these aren't mutually exclusive options. The parchments could include Luke and his own books. We don't know. Could include multiple things. If so, then here's what's sort of the stunning point, I think, is that the canon of Paul's letters might have actually been assembled by Paul. We tend to think that the canon was put together by someone later. Maybe in the 2nd century, someone says, I really love this Paul guy. Give me everything he wrote. So they go around, they collect all this Paul stuff, and they jam it together in a codex and start sending it out, as if that's how it happened. Why does it have to happen that way? What if it happened? What if Paul put out an official collection of his letters? Or if Paul had an official collection of his letters and then he died, and Timothy had that collection of letters, what would Timothy have done? He would have it copied and sent out, and he would have had all of them. Now, that tells us a lot about the stability of the letter collection, who put it together. Paul himself might have put it together with Timothy's help after the fact when he died, and it would have been preserved exactly as it was. But if that's true, it also explains something else. It also explains why we may not have certain letters that Paul wrote. We know Paul wrote a letter to this church and to that church, and we don't have a copy. Why not? Here's the possibility. It's possible that in certain circumstances, Paul may not have had available to him a scribe to make a copy. Could have been that he was on the road. Could have been that he was under duress. Could be that he was in prison. Could be a lot of situations where he didn't have access to a scribe. Even in prison, sometimes he would have access to a scribe, but sometimes you may not. And so is it possible that Paul may have written certain letters and there was no scribe to make a copy of them in his own archive? And so they got sent out and never heard from again. Never got that letter back. This, I think, could potentially explain why we have some letters of Paul and not others, because there's just some that never got their own copy made for Paul's personal collection. And so when the dust settled, you only had the 13 letters that we had copies of, and a few letters out there just never got copied before they got sent. Now, of course, the people who received them got them, but who knows what happened to them? They just got forgotten, lost, missed, who knows? But they never would have been included with the official Pauline letter collection, see? If they were never officially part of the delivered Pauline letter collection, they never would have had any momentum to get seen as part of that unit, which is why they probably got forgotten and lost and never heard from again. Now, regardless of what view you favor here, whether you think it's Luke or an Old Testament testimonial collection or whether it's his own letters, here's the thing I want you to see, is that already in Paul's day there's a twofold canon emerging. Old Testament and New Testament. Old Testament, sort of Jewish origins, and Christian. So you got a set of Old Testament books and a set of Christian writings. Even if it's not Paul or Luke, if it's Christian, Paul already conceives of these as two units. Two units that travel together, but they're still distinguishable, right? This, I think, is fascinating because it really does show, yet again, another example of sort of the seeds of canon that are floating around the early church. Okay, before we get to our last section on manuscripts here, let me pause for any comments on the Codex and how it might have been manifested even in the New Testament. Yep.
Was it maybe Q?
Oh, yeah. See, people have thought that. Yeah. Well, when I said a minute ago it could be an early sayings collection of Jesus, that would be Q-like. Actually, I think the concept of Q is 100% right. I think the particulars of Q are entirely unknowable. And when I say the concept of Q, if the concept of Q is simply, no doubt early Christians had these collections they probably put down in notebooks of what Jesus said and did, and there's probably different kinds of those circulating around at different points. I think that's pretty obvious. And there's actually a lot of evidence that Graham Stanton has put together and others that show that that's probably what happened. But that's a far cry from saying, oh, we know exactly what was in it, and here's all the conclusions we're going to reach from it, and we're going to have a Q community, and a Q1 and a Q2, and redactors, and we're going to declare there was no resurrection and crucifixion, and we're going to say that it was just this and that. I mean, that's just silly. So the concept of Q is, I think, totally legitimate. I think it might be Jesus' sayings like that. But like I said, my preferred theory is that it's Paul's own letters. I think the other thing that's sort of suggestive of Paul putting this together is, look at a letter like Philemon for a moment, okay? You got to admit that's a really kind of obscure letter. It's small. It's very, very particular about that situation. It's still, still Scripture, not denying that, of course. But it's the kind of letter that Paul would have had in his own collection because he wrote it. But if you were thinking about letters that the church picked later because they really loved them, Philemon probably wouldn't have made the cut. Okay? So what you see here is some sense in which this is the kind of collection that bears evidence of legitimacy. It's not a fake collection, a sort of greatest hits. It's kind of like, it is, I mean, the greatest hits analogy is not a bad one. So if you're like, we're going to put the greatest hits together in a collection, Philemon may not have been in it, but it's still something Paul really wrote. And so it kind of legitimizes the fact that this might just be a legitimate collection as a result. It seems like it's authentic because of that. Ben?
Were the materials for codices any less expensive than scrolls? Or?
People have suggested that it was monetary, that you were saving money by using a codex because you could write on both sides of the page. And therefore the scribal cost of producing a codex would be less than a scroll. But that's been challenged. Scholars go back and forth on that. Are you really saving money? There's other things that are complex about writing a codex that may have made scribal costs go up, not down. I don't know. I don't know if that's definitive enough. And besides, if it was a monetary savings, why didn't the Greco-Roman world do it? Did they not want to save money when they had books produced? I mean, part of the problem is you've got to find a reason that's distinctive to Christians. Money saving wouldn't be one of those, right?
The preceding program has been brought to you by Reformed Theological Seminary and may not be reproduced or disseminated in part or in whole for sale or for profit without express written consent. For more information on RTS degrees and programs, please visit us at www.rts.edu or call 1-855-854-6920.